such a concern for the well-being and the future of the city's Great Lake?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. There's a lot of concern out there for clean drinking water, and that's because of pollution, both historic pollution and some of the stuff that's coming in now. For Lake Michigan, there's a lot of concern about invasive species like Asian carp and what would happen to the lake if Asian carp got in, and it could really help decimate the fish populations that are there now. I think that if you talk to the scientists, they will tell you that some of the largest concerns are from other invasive species and for things like warming water, because as the climate gets warmer, no matter what you think the cause is, if the climate gets warmer, the lake water is also warming, and that really has an impact on which fish can survive and which can't. If you talk to people who live right here, they're going to say, well, our concern is about the beaches. Yeah. Can we swim in the lakes? Are this lake water going to be clean enough to swim in? Are beaches going to be healthy? And so for them, things like sewage overflows, making sure that sewage is cleaned before it's discharged is incredibly important. Also, pollution from facilities. There was a big controversy about the BP Whiting plant here in Indiana, and its pollution discharges into the lake as well. So there are sources of pollution still in Lake Michigan that people care about and are concerned about. And there are some larger forces at work too, like the encroachment of invasive species, like the warming lake water.
Okay, and can you explain exactly what are invasive species and how do they spread and why do they pose such a threat?
Invasive species are like pollution that reproduces. So they're species that are not native to the Great Lakes. And the ones we care about are the harmful invasive species. There are some that are benign, some that are harmful. And what happens is that they get into the lakes, they have no natural competition, and so they breed like crazy. And they take over entire niches in the ecosystem and crowd out the species that are native and supposed to be there in the first place. And because they have no natural predators, the ones that really get established, their populations explode, and they can cause all sorts of nuisances and health problems even for people who live in the Great Lakes. One of the big examples of invasive species that did this back in the 60s was alewives. Alewives are a small fish that compete with perch, for example, and they had no easy natural predators here. And they were introduced in the 60s, and their populations exploded. And then they got so numerous that there was a disease that went through them, and they all died. And there were millions of fish that washed up on the shores of Lake Michigan. I remember when I was a kid, you couldn't go to the beach because it was these thick mats of dead, decaying, rotting fish, and they were all alewives. And then, they clean them off the beach, and the next year they all die again. So eventually, somebody came up with the idea of introducing a natural predator, which is really dangerous because now you're introducing another invasive species called the first one. And the natural predator they chose to introduce was salmon. And so the salmon is an invasive species, an introduced invasive species. It's a valuable one, so we like that one. And it keeps actually the ecosystem in balance. In my mind, the definition of harmful versus good invasive species are which ones keep the ecosystem in balance, which ones enhance the resiliency of the system, and which ones throw it out of whack. So that's one example. And of course, since then, we've had many, many others. There's 186 reported invasive species in the Great Lakes right now. For a while, it was one new invader every 28 weeks.
How exactly do they get here, or how?
A couple different ways. The biggest vector is through the ballast water of ocean-going ships. So ships need ballast in their tanks so that they don't fall, they don't tip over. They need the ballast so that they're stable in the water. But when they pick up that ballast, say in the Black Sea or the China Sea, they're not only picking up water, they're picking up any organisms that live there. Then they take it across the ocean into the Great Lakes. When they discharge that ballast water, as they will, when they pick up freight, for example, they discharge ballast water because they want to keep the weight of the ship at about the same. All the water that they picked up and all the organisms they picked up in the Black Sea or in the China Sea or wherever get discharged in the Great Lakes. And that's how we get zebra and quagga mussels. They picked up zebra and quagga mussels in the Black Sea, traveled across the ocean, discharged it into Lake St. Clair, and they established residence there and exploded all over Great Lakes.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, there was an article in our paper here, the News Dispatch, about parasitic lampreys that had supposedly been causing some problems in the region. That's such a visually, obviously threatening example because they consume the fish. And would you say that that's one of the more sort of pernicious threats, or is it kind of just because of the fact that it's a big parasite? It might be a little, I don't know, overstated.
Well, it's actually a very significant threat, but it fortunately is one we do have control strategies for.
Right.
And so those lamprey, they're called sea lamprey, and they're actually they are rebounding in certain places where they shouldn't be. I mean, Lake Erie, for example, their populations are rising. In Lake Superior, they're getting larger as the water gets warmer. They have a longer chance to grow every season, so they're getting bigger. And these things are just awful. I mean, they fasten to the sides of fish and they suck their fluids out. They're the original vampire fish, really. And it used to be they found a specific chemical that only kills sea lamprey, and that's how they control them. They draw them into these sea lamprey traps and they distribute the chemical and kill them that way. And that keeps them under control. It doesn't wipe them out. But before that happened, there were awful stories of sea lamprey. We've been talking mostly about invasive species. The lamprey are like another set of invaders that come in through canals. Instead of there's three routes really. There's intentional introductions. There's accidental introductions through like dumping your bait by mistake. There's the ballast water introductions, and there's canals where they just swim through the canals. And that's the threat of Asian carp swimming through the Chicago canals into Lake Michigan, and that already happened. The sea lamprey swam in through the St. Lawrence Seaway. They came up when the seaway opened, and they changed the way the seaway is configured. They opened the Welland Canal, and they changed the way that worked. The sea lamprey swam upstream from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, and they've been here ever since. I could tell you really gross stories about sea lamprey.
Yeah,
Sounds like it.
That's pretty unsettling. I believe sterilization was another strategy that they used to some extent. I don't know if one is better than the other as far as preventing them from reproducing.
They've tried sterilization as well. It's a combination. You can't get them all, so you use lots of different things at the same time. You have to do that. So there's actual physical traps. There's chemicals. There's chemicals to sterilize. There's chemicals to kill. And that's the only. Once they're here, they're here. Once they're established, you can't get rid of them. The old saying for chemical pollution was that solution is the dilution to pollution, right? If you have a bad chemical, you dump it into a large lake, it'll dilute, it won't be hazardous anymore. We now know, in fact, that over time, those concentrations build up, so that's really not the solution. But it's even worse with invasive species, because if you dump in 3 pounds or 30 milligrams per liter, say, of lead into a water body, that lead doesn't reproduce, doesn't increase. You go drop in 3 pounds of zebra mussels, and pretty soon you'll have thousands or millions of pounds of zebra mussels. So, unlike lead, it doesn't wash through the system and go away.
Okay, I realize we're running low on time here, but I think one thing that everybody, as far as Lake Michigan is concerned, everybody can appreciate pollution, and I think there's more attention being paid to invasive species. Can you talk a little bit about how climate change relates to Lake Michigan specifically? Because I don't think to the layperson that connection is terribly prevalent.
Well, with climate change, no one knows what it's going to do to lake levels. Scientists, I think probably the majority believe that lake levels will decline, and some say that they're going to rise. So you can't judge the impact simply by whether the lake levels go up or down. We do know the water's going to be warmer. We knew there's going to be a lot more severe storms. Those two have huge impacts for the health of Lake Michigan. Warmer water promotes algae growth, it promotes algae blooms, it promotes invasive species. It also changes the way that fish interact. So the cold water fish that we value now, like trout and salmon, have a harder time. The whitefish, they have a harder time because the water's warmer. When storms come through, I don't know the statistics for Illinois or for Indiana. In Michigan, in the first 10 years of this decade, we've already had 3 100-year storms and 1 500-year storm. Those are the storms you'd expect once 100 years or once every 500 years. We had 3 of them in 10 years. And so what that does is it creates a huge, huge load of pollution that gets dumped, gets washed into the lakes from land. And that's like the pollution load. And then the other thing it does is this water comes all at once. And so it all washes into the lakes and through the lakes. It doesn't have time to percolate down to the groundwater. So our groundwater levels are falling. And the groundwater is not recharging as it should because of these heavier storms. And that means the lakes, the groundwater is the cold water that goes in the lakes. That's another, it's a double whammy. The lakes aren't being cooled by groundwater as they once were. And the streams that we rely on for fish they don't have as much groundwater, and their levels will start to fall. So we're going to see much higher levels, and sometimes when there are big storms, and much lower levels when there are dry periods because of the lakes. And that's just the lakes and the fish in the lakes. You look at the surrounding areas, and you're looking at farming, you're looking at agriculture, you're looking at trees, you're looking at gardeners. Everything's going to change because of that. And you're looking at pests. The Emerald Ash border has been a terrible problem, say in Michigan, where it's all the ash trees have had to be cut down in Michigan because this thing is invaded. Well, that's just one. Take a look at what's happening in the Rockies, and hundreds of thousands of acres of prime forest have been destroyed by the pine bark beetle, which is exploding. It's a native beetle, but it used to be killed by harsh winters. And so every year it would start over, the populations were very low. The winters aren't cold enough anymore, so the pine bark beetle is going nuts. And the impact on the Rockies is enormous. And so we're going to see those kinds of pests that are exploding